In a post-pandemic world, some countries have controlled infection rates and begun to show recovery, while others continue to experience high infection rates and continue to be in lockdown. Now, the next panel will discuss opinions on who will lead the global recovery. Joining us will be the governor of the Central Bank of the Philippines, Benjamin Diokno, the chief economic advisor to the government of India, Krishnamurthy Subramanian, and Scott Minerd, chairman of investments and global chief investment officer at Guggenheim. Session will be moderated by Laura Deal Lacey, executive director, Asia for the Milken Institute. Let's go now to the panel to hear their opinions on who will lead the global recovery.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's session, Global Overview, Who Will Lead Global Economic Recovery? I'm Laura Deal Lacey. I'm the Executive Director of the Milken Institute in Asia. I'll be your moderator today. For today's session, we have two highly distinguished and respected government leaders, Dr. Benjamin Diokno, Governor of the Central Bank of the Philippines, and Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. You can find their full bios on our website. 2019 was a strong year for many countries around the world. And as it relates to our speakers, we saw India overtake the UK and France to become the world's fifth largest economy. And we saw the Philippines achieve a GDP growth rate of over 6% for the eighth year in a row. Then COVID-19 hit and economic activity around the world came to a standstill. Numerous countries underwent lockdowns by closing borders to business travelers and tourists, sending employees and students home, and shutting down public spaces. But as a result, the ensuring economy inactivity has been affected through various sectors and industries, causing layoffs, business closures, and recessions. We're now just a year over this health pandemic with less than a month to go. Before the year finishes. And everybody wants to know what 2021 will bring. The first question is for the both of you. I would like to start with you, Governor. As we approach the end of 2020 and look forward to 2021, are we now on the road to recovery? Is the worst behind us? What indicators are you looking at that are shaping your outlook for 2021?
All right. Well, based on the October 2020 WAO of the IMF, they were kind of optimistic at that time, right? The world economy will contract by only 4.4%. That's better than their June 2020 WAO. But recent events, I think, point to a deterioration rather than a improvement in the short run. So I would look at the fourth quarter up to maybe the first quarter of next year as worse than the IMF forecast on the basis of the following developments. Number one, the deterioration of the situation in Europe, in the US, and in parts of Asia like Japan and South Korea. So I think in the short run, Q4 will be much worse than originally forecasted, and that will be up to the first quarter of 2021. But with the vaccine or vaccines, I think the outlook for 2021, the full year of 2021 and 2022 are quite bright. That's how I put it. The major, to me, the leading countries that will aid in the improvement will be China, of course, which is the number one or number two country in the world, and of course, the recovery in major parts of the world.
And Dr. Subramanian, same question to you. What is your 2020 outlook look like?
I think certainly 2021, I expect to be much better than 2020. The news that is coming in of vaccines being ready for administering across the world. We just saw the United Kingdom approve a vaccine. Many other countries are also very close to it. And given that the economic impact that we've seen across the world is primarily because of the pandemic, being able to bring that pandemic under control will have a positive economic impact as well. On two counts. One, sectors that have been affected by the need for social distancing will definitely see demand coming back. Secondly, crises are typically periods where economic uncertainty increases, and as a result, households typically go into a savings mode, and that is also something that affects discretionary consumption, especially. So with the with the pandemic likely to come under control in the coming year, I do expect that that aspect also to revive very well, and a lot of pent-up demand, especially on discretionary consumption and on sectors that have been impacted by the social distancing. Overall, I think we will have a much better year next year. Also, the base effect, across the world, a lower base this year will also help in the growth numbers being better.
Thank you both for your very hopeful and optimistic responses. I hope you're absolutely right. Second question to the both of you. We're living in an era that has been billed as the Asia century, driven by economic, social, and cultural forces rooted in Asia. Do you see Asia leading global economic recovery, even as other regions around the world continue to experience high infection and transmission rates? Governor, first you.
I think it is because in the second quarter itself, China had a great growth, and it's with the RCEP, especially with the agreements among the Asean countries, that will be a big boost to the global economy. But it depends also on how soon the vaccines will reach this part of the world. But I understand there's also vaccine coming from China and Russia and other parts of Europe, US. So that plus the early lead by China in this part of the world, I think will make Asia the leading region in the recovery phase of the pandemic.
Dr. Subramanian?
I think the last part of your question already mentioned, given the prospect of a vaccine coming and a lot of people getting inoculated and thereby herd immunity also arising across the world, I think the pandemic is likely to be brought under control in the coming year, and therefore the economic impact will be positive. As regards the role of Asia, I think it's important to have a historical perspective. I'll speak from the Indian perspective on this. Research by George Madison, for instance, has shown very, very clearly that for almost 3/4 of known economic history, which is 1750 AD, India accounted for more than 1/3 of the world's GDP. And just to give a perspective on how much of a dominance that was, the United States, which is now recognized as the world leader economically, has accounted for about 16 to 17% at its peak for half a century. In contrast, India accounted for more than 1/3 for 17 and a half centuries. And this came about because of the economic thought and the policies that were followed thereby. So given that perspective and the demographics that is playing out now, I do definitely see Asia also coming back to its vitality and thereby dominating economic growth in the coming period. In fact, if you in the historical perspective, India and China together had accounted for a large proportion of world GDP, which I do foresee going forward for it to be manifesting as well.
Thank you for that historical perspective and thoughts looking forward. Turning now to each one of your countries that are represented here, I would like to start with you again, Governor Diokno. I would like to get your perspective as a central bank governor. How much more room do you think there is for further stimulus in the Philippines and other ASEAN countries? There seems to be a consensus among central bankers that more fiscal stimulus is the way forward. But there isn't a consensus about how much more they can do and what should the policies be moving forward. What are your views on this?
The COVID-19 pandemic hit us from a position of strength. We actually learned our lessons from the Asian financial crisis, and so we have prepared our central bank, our banking industry well. And so we have a lot of with careful fiscal management, we have a lot of fiscal space. Our debt to GDP ratio, for example, when the COVID-19 hit us, was around 39.6%. That's the envy of many developed and developing countries. So we have been raising money, we have been borrowing, and our projection is that our debt to GDP ratio at its worst will not hit 60%, which is the prescribed level for developing countries. So we're okay on the fiscal side. We're also okay on the monetary side. We have prepared our banking industry well. In fact, our capital adequacy ratio is in the neighborhood of 16%. That's higher than the BSP prescribed 10%, and even higher than the BIS prescribed 8%. So we, on both the fiscal the and on monetary side, we have a lot of fiscal space.
That's good to hear that you're so well prepared for these unexpected events. Continue along these themes. Equity markets seem to be charting new heights every other day. There's so much euphoria driven by continued liquidity injections and promises of vaccines that seems to driving equities markets higher, especially in the US. As a policymaker, does this concern you? Or are there other trends that you may pose greater threats? How do you think the real economy is being reflected as opposed to the markets?
Well, of course, in the U.S., they talk about what's happening in Wall Street versus the common man, and that is also true, I think, for many countries. Of course, we celebrate that there's a lot of interest in the equities market, but I think for this pandemic, I think policymakers should focus on the sector that is hurt the most by this pandemic, meaning the poor, the unemployed, and of course the elderly. And so as we celebrate on the behavior of the stock market, I think we should not lose track of what's happening among the majority of the citizenry. So as in other countries, the stock market in the Philippines is very active, and that's because I think that I can attribute that to the liquidity globally. There's a lot of there's few investment potential possibilities at this point, whereas there's a lot of money floating around. So in search of profitability, I think the hot money is moving where they can make some money, right? And so but as a policymaker, I'm more concerned, for example, with foreign direct investments, which would translate into more jobs and more economic output rather than short-term money that can move in and out in such short notice. In fact, I view hot money as destabilizing. It's good when things are good, and it's bad when things are bad. And so they exacerbate the picture. So I think we should remain focused on the big chunk of our economy which were affected by this pandemic.
How do you see the Philippines performing compared to its ASEAN neighbors? Do you see it recovering faster or at the same rate as the rest of the region?
There is no one-size-fits-all description of what's going to happen. I think it depends on initial conditions. And As I said earlier, initial conditions in the Philippines are pretty good. We have a very low debt to GDP ratio. We have a manageable fiscal deficit around 3%. Under the current circumstances, we have increased it to 9% this year in response to the pandemic. The deficit to GDP ratio has been increased to 9%. It will be about 8.5% in next year and about 7% in 2022. So this early, we are already managing the fiscal consolidation as we go along and as we project the economy to perform. So on the fiscal side, we're okay. As I said earlier, on the monetary side, our banking industry is in pretty good shape. As this is as a result of 2 decades of reforms coming after the Asian financial crisis. The quality of loans are high, and our NPL will be in the neighborhood, maybe at its worst this year will be around 4%. Right now it's around 2.4%. That's non-performing loans. But we have already, this early, we have already passed or almost passed the law. It's now pending in Congress in a conference committee between the Senate and the House, creating Asset Management Corporation. During the Asian financial crisis, it took us 4 years to create asset management corporations to receive bad loans from banks. Now this year, we will be able to pass the asset management corporations on the same year that the crisis has emerged. So we're getting the cooperation of both houses of Congress. Also, the executive department and the monetary authorities are working in sync. And so we're very optimistic that we'll be one of the leading countries to emerge out of this pandemic.
How are SMEs in the Philippines performing now? You talked earlier about the real economy and how SMEs drive a large portion of the real economy. How have they dealt with the COVID crisis? How has the government supported them?
And we treat SMEs as really critical in our recovery. Around 99% of our corporations or firms can be considered as small, medium, and enterprises. And so we have a special program for them. We treat new loans to micro, small, and medium enterprises as part of the compliance with the reserve requirement of the central bank. So in that sense, there's additional lending or new lending for the micro, small, and medium enterprises. Also, there's a law. I mentioned that law, the FIST, or the fiscal that creation of asset management corporation. That is almost done. So that this year, and that will help the banks to unload their bad loans. And in that sense, that can also help the micro, small, and medium enterprises. And we've seen that our policy that I mentioned earlier, where additional lending or new lending to micro, small, and medium enterprises will be counted as compliance to our reserve requirement, has gained traction. There's a lot of lending now to micro, small, and medium enterprises.
Thank you, Governor, for these insights of what's happening in the world and in the Philippines. Diving a little deeper into India, Dr. Subramanian, as the country's chief economic advisor, you hold an important position to provide key policy recommendations based on your analysis on the state of the economy. What is the current state of India's economy? How is the government ensuring the economic experience a V-shaped recovery from the pandemic and not a long, prolonged U-shaped recovery?
If you would have seen some of the commentaries I gave after the first quarter numbers, I had mentioned very clearly that the 23.9% decline was exclusively because of the lockdown restrictions on economic activity that were imposed. And I had at that time mentioned that the high frequency indicators do suggest a V-shaped recovery, which is indeed what has manifested now. If you look across consumer durables, consumer non-durables, consumer goods, investment spending, the infrastructure sector, capital sector, a lot of variables, the recovery indeed has been a sharp V. And so India is already, experiencing that. To ensure that, this is sustained, what the Indian government has done is to launch a series of reforms. The reforms on the labor laws, the agricultural reforms, the emphasis on private sector participation, greater private sector participation in the economy, unleashing the power of markets much more. All these are an important part of the policy response that the Indian government has done. This is based on the recognition that the COVID crisis for emerging economies like India, is very different from prior crises where the impact is, could be on medium to long-term growth if the necessary policy actions are not taken. And having recognized that, therefore, the Indian government has, made a lot of effort in bringing out reforms which will accelerate productivity and thereby also have an impact on the medium to long-term, growth prospects. The big ideas that are underlying some of these reforms are threefold, and I want to bring that to everyone's attention. Firstly, as I mentioned, India historically was a dominant player in the world economy, as I just mentioned using George Madison's research. And that happened because the Indian economic aspect was one focused on ethical wealth creation. Our literature from Arthashastra to Tirukkural, in the north and the south of the country, emphasized ethical wealth creation, especially by enabling, markets, the invisible hand of markets, even though that specific language was not employed, and marrying that with the hand of trust. So that's what is really being done by the government to enable ethical wealth creation. A lot of policies have been implemented. Second, the effort over the last 6 years has been to significantly formalize the economy. This has been seen in the workforce, for instance. About 5% of those that used to be in casual labor as of 2011-12 are now, in the salaried class. There's been a 5% increase in the salaried class. And finally, there's been a lot of emphasis on the primary and secondary sectors of the economy, which is agriculture and manufacturing, because these are the ones that account for a lot of jobs in the economy. Formalization specifically, together with the emphasis on primary and secondary sectors, enables to bring resilience in the economy, which I think is important, especially now that the world has experienced two crises, the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis within the space of a decade. So that's been the emphasis, formalization, more job growth driven, economy, and is enabling the private sector, giving a lot more space and withdrawing some of the traditional role of the government that we saw during the socialist era in India.
You brought up an interesting point about ethical wealth creation as being a historical pillar for India's economic growth. And I would like to talk a little bit more about that. Here at the Milken Institute, our stakeholder groups are CEOs and CIOs of global asset owners and asset managers. And over the last several years, when we've been hosting our conferences and roundtables, we have seen growing pressure from these leaders to add more ESG-linked investment into their portfolios. Theme conscious capitalism or universal ownership. Why is ethical wealth creation important, and why should asset managers consider such ideals in their investment decisions?
I think the emphasis on ethical wealth creation is incredibly important because this is something that indeed delivered sustainable prosperity for India for 17 and a half centuries. As I was mentioning earlier, for that long period of time, India accounted for more than 33% of world's GDP. This brings in, ideas like climate change, sustainable growth, and growth that is focused on the long run. Even aspects of the, for instance, inequality and its ramifications. All these are part of the conversation. In India, for instance, we use this expression called Shubh Labh. These are, Shubh means good and Labh means profit, and they're actually used simultaneously together. For instance, during religious festivals, it's written, and what that means is basically making profits by doing good. And I think that's a key idea that asset managers, must definitely, be conscious about, because doing good and thereby, being profitable is something that generates sustained growth, and also growth in a way that does not really exacerbate inequalities. And this is, growth that involves good governance, which in itself also has, within itself, the focus on the long run and not just myopic decision making, which is, from one quarter to quarter, rather than looking at it in the long run, more innovation that can really enable such sustained recovery. So all these aspects are very clearly incorporated into this. This is specifically about enabling markets, but at the same time also addressing some of the failures of markets, especially on the governance aspects in the long run. So benefiting from markets, but at the same time also addressing some of the limitations of markets. That is the way to generate sustained growth, and that's where the Indian idea of ethical wealth creation can really be something that the world can benefit from.
Thank you for that response. I think those ideas are resonating with a growing group of asset owners and managers around the world. Turning now to the outcome of the US elections, President-elect Joe Biden has already named several individuals to key positions within his cabinet. How might his administration change the path of global economic recovery? India is included. And what policies are you expecting or watching out for in his first 100 days in office?
I think there would be two key areas that I would be watching. Firstly, on climate change, and second, on trade. And here's where I expect the Biden administration to go back to the traditional and more long run thinking on this, and together I think these would be good for the world. India especially would be benefiting from the change in the stance on trade, because India has always been a country that has played by the rules. In the world order, and as a transparent democracy that engages within the scope of rule of law, international rule of law, India would definitely be a country not only benefiting but also contributing to this significantly, as India and the United States are two countries that are large democracies, the two largest democracies, and those that are actually believe in following transparent rule of law. So I do expect India to actually work very closely with the Biden administration in bringing about more prosperity to the world.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think many people are just as optimistic as you are with the new incoming administration. I have now a final question for both of you, and I hope we can continue this optimistic tone as we wrap up this discussion. And it's been really interesting, and I'd like to thank you both for your time. So first to you, Governor Diokno, what are the bright spots you see happening in 2021, either in your country or in a specific industry or in the region? What should people be watching out for and excited about?
The new economy will be much, much different from the old economy. And we see the Philippines as recovering next year. We see the Philippine economy contracting by around 9% this year, but there will be a strong bounce back next year. And we will attribute this to a strong construction, both public and private. Real estate will also be a leading corporation. Investment in telecommunications will also be a leading indicator. And also, of course, there will be hopefully there will be strong confidence on the economy. Right now, there is the consumers are still afraid to go out and buy things that they used to buy. And so we expect a stronger consumption spending next year on our recovery towards the new economy.
Thank you, Governor. And now, Dr. Subramanian, same question. What would be the bright spots of 2021?
I think the most important bright spot that I'm, eagerly waiting for is the economy coming back to, to normalcy, especially with all of us, resuming our normal lives, which is going for a movie or, going to a restaurant, things that we were doing earlier before the pandemic, for all of us to resume those, and thereby, after the resumption of normal lives, economy also coming back to its normalcy, not only in India, but across the world.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. And yes, I think many in our audience share that sentiment, and I hope we come sooner than later. And with that said, we come to the end of this session. I would like to thank both speakers again, Governor Diokno and Dr. Subramanian, for sharing their insights on the path towards global recovery, not just for their countries, but for the whole world. Thank you for the optimism as we head into 2021. And thank you to our global audience who have tuned in for this session. I hope you found this discussion informative, helpful, and encouraging. Please join us for more terrific sessions throughout our program today and tomorrow with leaders from around the world. Thank you. Have a good day.
And thank you, Laura Lacey. And as Governor Diokno, Chief Economic Advisor Subramanian, we appreciate that you're sharing with us today different opinions on the road to global recovery.